Hey everybody, I'm Rob Singleton, and I'm finally talking about what a lot of people have asked me to talk about, the conflict between Israel and Palestine. It's one of the oldest human conflicts in history, and it can't all be handled in one video, but I'm going to accomplish something else with this video as well. Sometimes people say, does everything for you come down to the Bible? Well, as a pastor, it actually does. But they say, can arguments be made with extra biblical sources? And they can, and just with facts and logic. So in this first video about it, I want to talk about some truths that are pretty tough to receive, but it doesn't make them any less true about this conflict. Let's start here. What's the oldest human conflict in history? Well, it's not between Israel and Palestine. The oldest one is probably Cain and Abel, between those first two brothers. But when there's two groups, there are a few that are older than the conflict between Jews and Arabs that dates all the way back to Abraham and the tension between his son of promise, Isaac, and the son he had out of wedlock with his maidservant Hagar, named Ishmael. See, these participants, how old is this? Well, they lived over 2,100 years before Christ, and that's about how old this religious / political / real estate centered / family feud conflict has been around. And it invokes much passion on both sides. And there's no shortage of trigger words to go around with this thing. Are we talking about a place called Palestine? Should this be called Israel? Are these occupiers? Are they terrorists? Is this about Isaac? Did it start with Ishmael? How about Hagar? What about Sarah? Are the Jews Zionists? What are they? Freedom fighters? Is this about Judaism as a religion? Is this about Islam? What about Christianity? How about all three? Who's right? Who's wrong? But most importantly, we need to talk about why you should care. Well, I'm Pastor Rob Singleton on a John 8:32 mission to restore truth. Now, John 8:32 is when Jesus said in the Gospel of John, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus is truth. John 14:6, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And sometimes they say truth hurts. So on this mission, we're going to give you the truth, whether it hurts or not. Now, would you do us a favor to help us keep getting these videos to you? Please subscribe and hit the notification bell, or give a 5-star review if you're listening via podcast. All of that really helps. All right, so on October 7th, about 5 months ago, the world was rocked to its core when scenes of mass killing, kidnapping, torture, rape, even hideous things done to small children and babies was broadcast live by the perpetrators who actually wanted the world to see the depths of their depravity. I did several Instagram short videos on this horrific situation, but now that almost 5 months have passed, like I said, I want to give a biblically historical account of what's really going on, and most of the biblical side of that will be in the next video. For now, let me just say this. In order to do that, we're going to have to back up. And it's going to be painful to watch. But I need to remind everyone just how horrific the events of October 7th really were. Take a look.
This is what the world really is when you rip off the veneer of civilization. When Judeo-Christian morality disappears. When morality disappears. Generally speaking, what you end up with is words that there are no words for this sort of evil. There are no words for it. You can't describe. It's not animalistic because animals would not treat each other this way. It's not animal. It's not monstrous because there are no monsters. There are only human beings. They're only some of the most demonic, evil pieces of human excrement ever to walk the planet. That's what Hamas is. Here is a video of an entire family murdered. You can see these are women on the floor, the men on the floor. This is Hamas putting out this video. Again, this is not the Israelis. Hamas is putting out this video. There's an entire family in their home. They've been gunned down and murdered. And they're just shooting people who are already dead on the floor. These are videos that were taken in the aftermath. You can see these are people strewn on the ground. Okay. Entire families. You can see here just minivans filled with the dead. Say Ima. Ima means mother, means mom in Hebrew by Hamas. The mother is saying it didn't happen. The children are crying because their older sister has been murdered. The children are crying. The child is saying, the younger brother is saying, I wanted her to stay alive. And the girl is saying, there's no chance she'll come back. And the mother says no. But celebrations took place in Turkey. Here's some of the tape from Turkey, because this is what you do when you murder women, rape them, kill babies, kidnap them. This is what you do. If you're an Islamist, you celebrate. Here's video from Turkey. Thousands of people cheering. If the God that you cheer seeks the murder of babies and their kidnapping and the rape of women, let me suggest that you're not worshiping God.
Well, I'm sure most of you have seen enough, but I agree with Ben Shapiro that we need to look in the face of evil, because the only alternative is to put our face in the sand and pretend like it didn't happen. And as they say, if nothing changes, nothing changes. However, did you notice as we look at this evil in the face, the first thing you should have noticed anyway is that the level of terror and moralist horror eclipses maybe even the worst atrocities we've ever seen or heard of. This is, in short, evil at a whole new level. This event in and of itself was different because we're so used to terrorists trying to seize the narrative and somehow spin things to make it look like they did nothing wrong, or even more far-fetched, that they are the real victims. To help accomplish this in the past, terrorists were careful not to show their violent and depraved acts, especially on film. And yet, here the world sat and watched mouths agape as zero attempt was made to hide the heartless cruelty, the barbaric acts, and the callous disregard for even the suffering of children. Quite the opposite. They live streamed much of it on social media. Again, why would they do this? Well, lean in, because what's going on here will be hard to stomach. Also, what's going on here is also why even more conservative commentators that I usually agree with may be unwittingly adding fuel to the fire, because they've apparently missed one cold-hearted fact I guess they don't want to receive. In a sea of purposely manufactured emotions, they've missed this. And that is that Hamas obviously wanted the world to be rattled so that it would provoke no less than the one response it could have from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And that even if, listen, tens of thousands of men, women, and children had to die for the cause, so be it. The end goal of the annihilation of Israel and all the Jews, to them, would be worth it. Now, I'm not saying this just off the cuff. They write this down and proudly display it. But what many miss is that the evil leaders of Hamas, the very highest in the terrorist organization of Hamas, they weren't risking their lives. Most of them live comfortably as multimillionaires in places like Dubai, while everyday people in Gaza pay the ultimate price to put forth the anti-Jewish narrative. Now, all of this put the tiny nation of Israel, and by tiny I mean roughly the size of New Jersey in the United States, one of the smallest states, well, it put them in an almost impossible situation. They must root out Hamas completely. You can't even leave any of them in place. But to do so, they have to separate the wheat from the chaff, as they say. And in this case, the chaff have all but glued themselves to the wheat. Hamas uses children and families as human shields. I think we've all heard that by now, and it's true. They fire missiles from elementary schools and underneath hospitals, and they keep hostages tethered to terrorists in the tunnels beneath apartments and neighborhoods throughout Gaza. In other words, it's impossible to destroy Hamas without significant damage to civilians all over Gaza, and that's exactly the way Hamas planned it. With each passing day and newscasts that happen every day, the world's treated a one-sided propaganda, I believe, that makes it seem as though Israel enjoys killing people for no reason other than getting a little bit more land. Land that they curiously keep giving away for peace. And peace they keep missing out on despite all their best efforts. And those efforts are worth mentioning, even if we think we don't want to hear another word about it. But listen, there have been many efforts at peace throughout the years. But you know what there hasn't been much of? Even one compromise by the other side whatsoever. Now, Right here, I can almost hear someone saying, that's not true. There have been many truces and pauses and ceasefires from both sides. Yep, there have been those. While Israel's enemies take time to reload. However, I'll say it again, not because we need to understand this, but we need to face it. Not one offer of a two-state solution, of a land swap for recognizing Israel, of a return to former borders, etc., has ever been permitted by Israel's enemies to lay this whole thing to rest. Not one. Now, any rational thinking person faced with this hard truth needs to wrestle with the cold reality of why. So, here it is. If Hamas, Hezbollah, the PLO, or any other organization on the other side were to collectively lay down their weapons, there would be peace. However, if Israel were to lay down her weapons, there would be no more Israel. Now, how do I say something like that with absolute certainty? Because the stated, and in some cases written, goal of one side is the total annihilation of the other. One side wants the Israelites and all Jews completely wiped out off the face of the earth, and anything short of that for them is unacceptable. So question, how can you work with this? Answer, you can't. So Israel is doing what they have to, what they have no other choice but to do. They are surgically and carefully going after the terrorist as carefully as they possibly can. They warn populations before they bomb, they put out leaflets, they put out radio calls, they do everything they can, but when Hamas learns of it, they force the Gazans to stay put under threat of death if they try to flee, so they can't win. When there is a ceasefire with the hope of civilians getting out, Hamas blocks all escape routes, and once again, they force the civilian population to stay and die so that they can be news fodder for the narrative. Guess what? It's working. A largely uneducated Western world and almost totally uneducated American population sees the nightly news reports and comes to the very conclusion that their hurting hearts is obviously going to lead them to stop the genocide. Again, this was the goal of Hamas all along, and they justify even the loss of their own people by saying that, well, the ends is going to justify the means. And again, what is Hamas' stated end goal? The complete annihilation of every Jew. Written down, by the way. Usually put a bit more poetically at times with such slogans as, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Which raises a question. What river? Answer, the Jordan River. And it runs from the Sea of Galilee in the north to the Dead Sea in the south. Okay, thanks for that geography lesson, Pastor Rob. What sea? Well, the sea on the west would be the Mediterranean Sea. Why does that matter? Well, taken all together, what does this include? Well, there's a one-word description for this area that they chant about. It's called Israel. So, what the sing-songy chant means is that this whole thing will finally be over when there's no more Israel or a single Jew left in the region. A fancy, long-about way of describing genocide. Now, for the real reason I've waited this long to do a video on this, I've sat and watched as Christian after Christian after Christian falls for the propaganda, and though they started off, almost everybody agreeing that Israel had to deal with Hamas and root them out, through the real war, which I call the war of attrition, Hamas seems to be beginning to recapture the narrative. Today, even some respected evangelical pastors and ministry leaders are being duped, I think, into believing the slow historical rewrite from evil. In recent weeks, Palestinian Christians and their American sympathizers have been successfully promoting a narrative aimed at turning the rising generation of evangelicals against Israel, the millennials and the Gen Z young people. And because of this push, more young leaders are playing the role of Switzerland. I don't know how else to put it. They're trying to be neutral in the conflict. While others are overtly, just taking a side, and that side is to criticize support for Israel. That's what's gaining in popularity. And it's a trendy way for them to demonstrate their Christian compassion, read here, virtue signal, and their political independence. In short, I'm trying to figure out a nice way to say it, but these largely clueless and historically illiterate protesters are talking about something they have no knowledge of. And they're fighting to be heard and to stem the tide against Israel based far more on emotion than facts. Look at the following from israelmyglory.org. I gave you the website so you can look it up yourself. Quote, "There's nothing new about the efforts to drive a wedge between America's evangelicals and Israel. Many in the anti-Israel camp have been working for years to do exactly that. Anti-Israel Palestinian Christians such as Sami Awad and Naim Atik have traveled the country telling American Christians about Israeli oppression. Left-leaning evangelicals such as Jim Wallace, Tony Campolo, and Sergei Duss, I think it is, have echoed this narrative in their corner of the Christian world. Duss's sons, Brian and Matt, have even worked diligently to mainstream their father's views within the fields of Christian philanthropy and Democratic Party policymaking. Now, I've even listened to some of my favorites fall prey to this, such as Candace Owens. I love what she has to say nearly all the time. And she still sees evil as evil and has an incredibly quick, wise mind. But at the same time, she seems to be drawing a moral equivalency between October 7th and the war in Gaza. And I've listened to her over and over about this, and I see a recurring thread. But the moral equivalency deal doesn't exist. Well, one is a cause, the terror attacks on October 7th. The other is an effect or a reaction, the ongoing war to root out Hamas in Gaza, that the Israeli Defense Forces have honestly little choice in. Hamas simply cannot be allowed to exist. They are morally bankrupt and beyond redemption. Now, add to these the kinos, I call them, Christians in name only, such as the previously mentioned Jim Wallace, Tony Campolo, Sergei Duss, and add to them maybe Porter Speakman, Mark Green, and honestly, a growing group of many, many others, and it only muddies the water all the more. So let me try to wrap up and bring this whole thing home. The reason why Israel cannot back down and must root out evil is because their enemies have framed the entire conflict in an unsurvivable way for the Jewish people. For nearly 80 years, Israel's enemies have made one thing crystal clear, and I know I've said it before, but here it is. The only acceptable outcome for them is that Israel cease to exist and Jews are wiped out. An outcome that simply cannot happen and absolutely cannot be negotiated with. All of which leaves Israel no choice but to do what they are doing, and sadly, most likely a whole lot more if there's ever going to be peace in the region. Well, you've been watching Ask Piro. Until next time, peace. Hopefully, real peace.